progress real at the point at which masses move and act. There's this extraordinary moment, just as cinematography, when the nurse holds up the dead child and she herself is shot by the white troops in Battleship Potemkin on the steps as the soldiers come down with their bayonets. And I always sense there is something pre-cinematic about Carlyle's writing about history. Now, in the repositioning of Cromwell, he's not concerned about certain ideological matters that might interest people here about Cromwell. He's interested in the idea of a man, particularly comes out of the extreme Protestant dispensation, an Englishman, of course, an English revolutionary, who changes the reality of his society and his time through an act of will, and does so in relation to foregrounded moral ideas. Political action which is not based upon personal conviction, to Carlyle, is always worthless and better not to try. Now, as his career goes on, he becomes more of a sage, more looked to, more hostile to the extreme forms of capitalism that are developing all around him in England. One of the most extraordinary things about him, although Dickens does it as well to a degree, is he's so aware of the raw energy of England then. Like China now, pollution everywhere, exploitation everywhere, enormous amounts of wealth everywhere, extreme poverty everywhere. The radicalism of that society and the sort of striving and creation of gold out of the ground and new classes of men, tough-faced men from the north of England and elsewhere who were titans. Theodore Dreiser wrote a book in the early part of the 20th century in America called The Titan, about these entrepreneur and factory owners who almost come from nothing and within one generation are sitting in Parliament, peers, calling the shots for the entire society and its empire. Carlyle was an imperialist, but he believed it should be based upon certain moralities of form. He was a nationalist in certain respects, and yet at the same time his feeling for nationality was very complex, aesthetic, very like Kipling's in Recessional in many ways. A profound, reactionary and yet rebellious spirit, whereby you looked at things, sought to meld them and move them in accordance with the energy of the hour, and always sought to find divine purpose in the actions of men. Where he found that there wasn't such, he moved away. Now, or he didn't give it cultural endorsement. It's a great talker, a great raconteur, a great celebrity in a period where celebrity meant something slightly different to what it means today. There's a famous incident in which a woman at a salon said to Carlyle, "I do believe, Mr. Carlyle," she said, "in the idea of the interconnectedness of the universe." And Carlyle rumbled in reply, "You'd better," in a Scotch accent, because he was quite a character. He was a sort of the most extraordinary religious and literary incendiary that this society produced in the 19th century. Now, towards the end of his life, he wanted to find one ruler in relation to the chaos of Victorian modernity who he could posit as a counterbalance and wait. Frederick the Great of Prussia was for him, in his ideological way of looking at the literary text of his area of that monarch's life, a way of exploring the idea of benevolent dictatorship. Carlyle is opposed to democracy. Carlyle doesn't believe in rule by majority. Carlyle doesn't believe in coherent, stratified, old-style rule by aristocracy. Certainly not an aristocracy that does not reform, and certainly an aristocracy that has no concern paternally for the plight of the people, particularly at the bottom. His sort of socialism, socialistic and solidarist beliefs are inegalitarian and always elitist, because morality and will and vigour and power comes from above to below in all areas of life. But those at the top have to be worthy of ruling those at the bottom. Otherwise, in his opinion, they will be judged by history. As he got older, he became, in contemporary terms, and in terms that he'd used himself, more and more right-wing. And he prefigures some of the authoritarian social movements of the 20th century, for whom, in many ways, he was an illuminating character. It's interesting to note that many of the great figures, Arnold, Ruskin, Morris, many of them alleged champions of the left. Many a faceless tower block called Morris Block or something was put up by old Labour in the 1960s and so on. Yet in many ways, these romantics, these socialists, these conceptual pre-Raphaelite types, these neo-medievalists, were actually looking back to past orders of social organicism. They weren't looking forward to the modern left. They were actually, in some ways, quasi-right-wing individuals who have been repositioned, falsely positioned, as neo-leftists in the early part of the 20th century. Carlyle is part of the authoritarian right-wing tradition. He's also a figure that uniquely can be used in British terms, in British circumstances. Many people who are just concentric to these islands wonder where our, quote-unquote, Nietzsche is, where our figure of indomitable literary power and glory might be, where our sort of, a combination, if you like, of sort of Jack London and Nietzsche in certain respects, where our figure is. I, as a modest proposal of my own, unlike Swift's, would put forward the idea of Thomas Carlyle as a man who, in the translations of German idealism, in his book upon the philosophy of clothes, which rips them away and shreds utilitaria and demands a spiritual dimension to the complications of early 19th century life, to his analysis of the French Revolution as the climacteric of that period, of the period in which his sensibility was formed, in relation to his desire to even preserve the existence of slavery, whereby he looked back to the ancient world and analysed the enormous numbers of forms. Don't forget, serfdom in Russia wasn't abolished till the 1860s. The inequality and service takes in all forms of societies, ancient, modern, and medieval. In his attempt to explicate the medieval world, where he sees in a medieval abbot a sort of integratedness of life, a solemnity and a stoicism of purpose that moderns lack. The modern society for many is alienated, is broken down, is inorganic, is increasingly meaningless. The great thing about a lot of these 19th century sages is that they are talking to us. They are talking to what internally the modern West has become, even though they're 100, 150 years out of date, quote unquote. The interesting thing is the most advanced European intellectuals realised many of the crises that were going to come for our civilization long before it began to dawn on mass consciousness, that our old religion would collapse. That, as Nietzsche said at the end of the 19th century, that will be a liberation, certainly for certain elite spirits, but it'll also be a great burden for the majority, because it's left them bereft. It's left them with nothing. It's left them in the culture of the ruins and the ruins of culture. The extreme right in the 20th century was one of the formulations whereby we attempted to reconstitute certain of the hollowness that existed in the modernity which has come down to us. An extreme alliance of bedfellows who were completely at variance with each other, as their subsequent warfare showed, namely the ultra-capitalist, most Western powers of all, and communism, combined to destroy it. And we are, in some ways, culturally, amidst hyper-modernity, living in the ruins. But Carlyle's work, from his analysis of the stoicism and mental and moral and linguistic integration of a medieval abbot in comparison to a modern factory owner, to his hostility to modern democracy, where the masses are bought and sold shoddy packages and lied to perpetually by politicians who change their opinion in an instant, in parliaments that have little or no moral integrity and are based upon no philosophical precepts at all, in relation to an aesthetics and an architecture which even in his era he perceived as inferior to the past. He speaks to us now through his revolutionary energy, through his use of Protestant diction, for his respect for the individual. The Western culture begins and ends with a supreme individual mind. It's partial, it's nominalist, it's perspectival. It looks at life from the perspective, hopefully heroic, of a coherent individuality. It often doesn't say it has the whole truth, but it is participatory to the explication and evolutionary revelation of the prospect of the truth. And these men are the great geniuses of our civilization. They don't have every answer, but they open up a plenitude of partially answered questions, the nature of which you need